Your knees press into scorching sand that sears through flesh. Your legs tremble, locked in position, overwhelmed by exhaustion and relentless heat. A metal restraint wraps your throat, fastened so firmly that each attempt to swallow feels suffocating. A heavy chain connects you to 11 other women, positioned close enough that their smallest movements ripple through the line, close enough to detect the rhythm of their breathing. One weeps softly nearby. Another murmurs words of prayer in syllables foreign to your ears, yet the desperation in them needs no translation. A figure's shadow crosses your vision. For a fleeting instant, the brutal sun vanishes. A cruel moment of relief washes over you before rough hands grip your face. Your mouth is pried open forcefully. Fingers invade, pressing against teeth, exploring gums, reaching toward your throat's back. Your body convulses in protest, attempting to pull away, but the chain snaps taut. The inspection continues without pause. He examines your tongue for signs of disease, forces your eyelids wide to check the clarity of your eyes, hooks a finger inside your lip, and drags it downward, displaying your mouth as one would examine livestock at auction. Because that precisely describes your new reality. You haven't yet grasped this truth, but this examination will determine the trajectory of your remaining years. For the man conducting this assessment, this moment carries no significance whatsoever. Your face will fade from his memory before sunset arrives. 12 days earlier, this nightmare wasn't your existence. 12 days ago, you were the daughter of a community leader somewhere in the Sahel region. You awakened each morning to your mother's voice calling your name. You knew every pathway connecting the village dwellings. You understood where shade appeared at midday. You possessed a name that carried meaning and history. She's gone now. You witnessed her final moments, and you continued walking afterward because the armed men established their rule without needing words. Stop moving and you share her fate. In Arabic, a specific word describes what you've become. The term translates loosely, but that translation is sanitized, far too gentle, concealing the brutal reality. What the word truly signifies is this: your body represents merchandise. Your future belongs to whoever purchases you. Your past has been erased from existence. The man examining you steps backward. He offers a slight nod of approval. Another man advances, carrying a leather pouch. The distinctive sound of shifting coins reaches your ears. Currency exchanges hands. You have just been sold for the third time within this month alone, and the destination they're transporting you toward is a place historians will spend centuries attempting to erase from collective memory. This represents the Arab-controlled trade system, 14 million African people, more than 13 centuries of operation. That duration matters profoundly beyond the numerical count. Systems don't persist for 1,300 years unless they receive careful, deliberate maintenance. A network so devastatingly efficient at eliminating human existence that almost no descendants remain to preserve the narrative. If this historical account resonates with you, subscribe to my channel, because we refuse to look away from the stories the world attempted to bury forever. You already possess knowledge about the Atlantic system, vessels, restraints, forced labor estates across the Americas, 12 million African people transported across ocean waters over approximately 400 years. That historical period has established museums, memorial sites, cinematic portrayals. Children learn about it in educational settings. Political figures reference it in public addresses. But another system existed, older in origin, longer in duration, and by certain measurements even more extensive. The Arab-controlled network began in the 7th century, following the rise and expansion that swept across North Africa. It didn't conclude until the 20th century. Saudi Arabia officially ended the practice in 1962. Mauritania followed in 1981. These aren't ancient historical dates. These are years your grandparents remember living through. People alive today were born into societies where this system still operated under legal protection. Between approximately 650 AD and 1900 AD, historians estimate that between 14 and 17 million African people were forcibly removed from their homes and transported to North Africa, the Middle East, and the Arabian Peninsula. Some scholars believe the actual number exceeds these estimates. Records were inconsistent and incomplete. Deaths went unrecorded. Entire transport groups vanished without any documentation. More people over a substantially longer time span moved through routes crossing 3 continents. And yet almost no one discusses it. Why? Because this network was engineered to leave nothing behind as evidence, and it succeeded. In the United States today, approximately 45 million people of African descent reside. Their existence serves as living evidence. Their communities preserve memory across generations. Their ongoing struggles ensure the history cannot disappear. But in the Middle East, after 13 centuries of importing millions of African people, there is almost nothing remaining. Small communities in Yemen, scattered populations in southern Iraq, a few thousand individuals in Morocco, tiny remnants where there should be millions. So where did 14 million people go? Historians searched for migration patterns. They searched for lost documentation. They did not want to accept the answer they eventually discovered. The answer represents the darkest aspect of this entire historical account. The men were forcibly rendered incapable of reproduction. This is not speculation or rumor. It is documented across hundreds of primary sources spanning centuries. Traders systematically performed this procedure on African males at rates estimated between 80 and 90%. The procedure was carried out at specific points along the transport routes. Egyptian monasteries became infamous for performing these operations. Certain religious figures developed techniques that marginally improved survival rates. For every man who survived, 3 to 5 died from blood loss, infection, or physical shock. Some accounts suggest even higher mortality rates. Consider the mathematics. If a trader wanted 100 living individuals to sell at market, he might begin with 400 to 500 men. To the traders, this wasn't considered devastation. It was calculated business cost. The rest perished in agony across the sand. The logic was cruel but efficient from their perspective. Individuals rendered unable to reproduce could not form families. They could not build communities strong enough to resist. They could not leave descendants who might one day demand accountability. They labored, they aged, they died, and they were replaced by the next raid, generation after generation, for over 1,300 years. But the women served an entirely different purpose. They were kept capable of bearing children, preserved specifically for what their bodies could produce. And what happened to them is a story that historical records describe only through euphemism, through careful wording, through deliberate silences, through details considered too disturbing to record openly. The system required constant supply. Arab merchants were not typically the raiders themselves. They were businessmen operating vast commercial networks stretching across continents. They did not personally attack villages. Instead, they built economic systems that encouraged African groups to capture and sell one another. Firearms flowed into the continent. European weapons traded through Arab intermediaries. Textiles, luxury goods, salt precious in sub-Saharan regions, and in return, human beings. The kingdom of Dahomey, in what is now Benin, became one of the major suppliers. Its economy grew dependent on annual raids against neighboring peoples. The Sultanate of Zanzibar controlled the East African routes. The Funj Sultanates dominated the Nile corridor. Tuareg groups controlled trans-Saharan passages. African kingdoms went to war not for territory but for people. Captured survivors were marched to collection points and sold to Arab traders. The cycle fed itself endlessly. More weapons meant more successful raids. More raids meant more captives. More captives meant more buying power. More buying power meant more weapons. A machine that consumed human suffering and grew stronger with every life it devoured. Villages were attacked at dawn when resistance was weakest. Warriors surrounded settlements while people slept. The assault was sudden and overwhelming. Men who fought back were eliminated immediately. Men who surrendered were inspected on the spot for age, health, and strength. Young, strong men were separated for the procedure and sale. Older men with little market value were often eliminated where they stood. But the women faced a different calculation. Traders examined them carefully. Age mattered significantly. Girls too young required years of resources before becoming profitable. Women too old brought reduced prices. The ideal age fell in between. And what happened to the women who met those ideal criteria is where this story continues. The most valuable age range fell between roughly 13 and 25 years old. Old enough to survive what lay ahead. Young enough to be exploited for decades. Appearance mattered considerably. Markets had precise preferences understood instinctively by experienced traders. Certain physical characteristics, certain facial features, subtle differences that could double or triple a price depending on the destination. Different regions wanted different things. Across nearly every market, women from Ethiopia commanded the highest prices. Their features were widely considered desirable. A woman from those regions could sell for twice, sometimes 3 times, what others brought. Those who met the preferred criteria were separated immediately. They received slightly better treatment during transport. Marginally more care, not from mercy, never mercy. Damaged merchandise lost value. Preserving the investment was simply sound business practice. Families were destroyed at capture sites or centralized collection points. Mothers torn from children, husbands separated from wives, sisters dragged away from brothers. Lifelong bonds were destroyed in minutes with no possibility of reunion. European missionaries and explorers who witnessed these separations left written accounts of scenes they struggled to describe. The screaming, the desperate grasping as families clung to one another for seconds longer. Final touches of skin, final sounds of familiar voices. Then the restraints tightened, and people who had shared entire lives were pulled in opposite directions, never to meet again, never to know what became of one another. One missionary wrote that the cries followed him for years afterward, that even decades later, he could still hear mothers calling for children who would never answer. No matter how far he traveled, the sounds accompanied him. Those cries echoed across Africa for 13 centuries, and almost no one beyond the continent ever heard them. Then came the Sahara. The trans-Saharan routes were not measured in distance, but in casualties. Picture the span from New York to Denver. Now imagine crossing it on foot in restraints with almost no water beneath a sun that brings death. From collection points in sub-Saharan Africa to the great northern markets of Tripoli, Tunis, Cairo, and Marrakesh, transport groups traveled staggering distances. Some routes exceeded 2,000 miles. Others stretched even farther. The journey took 2 to 3 months under ideal conditions. Conditions were never ideal. The Sahara is Earth's largest hot desert. Daytime temperatures routinely climb past 120 degrees. Sand becomes hot enough to blister skin on contact. Shade is non-existent for hundreds of miles. Then night arrives. Temperatures plunge. The same desert that scorched bodies by day could freeze them after dark. The sheer temperature swing alone ended countless lives. Water became the most valuable resource, rationed with ruthless calculation. Camels needed water to survive. Camels were costly. Camels carried goods. The captives were cheaper than animals. They could be replaced. So water went to the camels first. Whatever remained, if anything remained, went to the humans. Lips split until they bled. Tongues swelled. Throats burned, and always the knowledge that there was nothing to drink with hundreds of miles still ahead. Food was scarce, dried dates, sometimes bits of meat, just enough to keep bodies moving. Never enough to preserve strength over months of walking. Mortality was constant. Historians estimate that between 20 and 30% of captives perished during Saharan crossings. Some transport groups lost half of their human cargo. Others arrived with losses exceeding 60%. Those who collapsed were abandoned. By the time this happened, no one reacted emotionally. That was how the group leaders knew the system was functioning. Stopping to bury the deceased slowed the caravan. Stopping to help the dying risked losing the living. The calculations left no room for compassion. People were left sitting in the sand, too weak to continue, watching the caravan disappear as they waited for death. Over time, the routes themselves became marked by bones. Heinrich Barth, a German explorer who crossed the Sahara in the 1850s, recorded what he witnessed. He described paths littered with human skeletons. In some valleys, the remains were so dense that it was difficult not to step on them. Skulls bleached white by the sun. Rib cages half buried in drifting sand. These were not ancient bones. They were recent, fresh additions to trails that had been collecting bodies for over 1,000 years. René Cailly documented similar scenes along western routes. He wrote of valleys that appeared white from a distance, not from sand, but from accumulated remains. Gustav Nachtigall described regions where skulls and bones gave the ground a pavement, like hardness beneath one's feet. Hundreds of thousands of people, possibly millions over 13 centuries. Their remains scattered across the largest desert on Earth, marking the paths that consumed them. Silent evidence of a system the world chose not to see. For the women who survived, who somehow endured the thirst, the heat, the cold, the starvation, arrival at a North African port meant only that the immediate dying had stopped. Nothing more. Survival carried its own price. Many arrived broken in ways that left no visible marks. Their bodies completed the journey. Their spirits did not. What awaited them next was not an end, but a transformation. The markets of the Arab world were ancient institutions refined over centuries into systems of terrifying efficiency. By the time European observers began documenting them, Cairo's market had operated continuously for over 1,000 years. Generation after generation of traders perfected the routines, pricing, classification, inspection. Buyers arrived from across the Islamic world and beyond. Ottoman nobles from Constantinople, Persian merchants from Isfahan, wealthy households from Damascus and Baghdad, traders from the Gulf seeking domestic workers. Even Europeans, despite official prohibitions, found ways to participate. Markets were divided by category. Unskilled laborers in one section, skilled workers in another, domestic workers elsewhere, and behind screens in restricted areas, women intended for private sale. The evaluation process was methodical. To someone observing it for the first time, the calm was the most disturbing aspect. Teeth were examined first. Dental condition revealed age and health. Experienced buyers could estimate remaining years of usefulness from teeth alone. Then skin was inspected for disease, scars, and imperfections. Hair was examined for texture and length. Then everything else. Those paying the highest prices demanded the most thorough assessments. The examinations were invasive and intimate, carried out with the same detachment a livestock trader might show when judging animals. European travelers left accounts so explicit that publishers often censored them. One British observer in the 1830s wrote that the women were forced to walk, turn, and present themselves in ways inappropriate for polite description. Examined with the same cold calculation applied to evaluating horses. Prices varied by origin, appearance, and intended use. Common women sold for modest amounts. Women with preferred features fetched far higher sums. Young individuals from favored regions could sell for the equivalent of several years' wages. The highest prices were paid quietly through agents acting on behalf of the wealthiest households. Zanzibar became the largest market in the Indian Ocean world. At its height, roughly 50,000 people passed through each year. The island's economy revolved almost entirely around human commerce. David Livingstone witnessed the system firsthand. What he saw altered him permanently. He wrote that no description could exaggerate its evils, that the scenes were so horrifying he tried unsuccessfully to erase them from memory. The market remained open until 1873, when British pressure finally forced its closure. A treaty was signed. Public auctions were officially banned, but the practice did not end. It simply went underground. Ships sailed at night. Transactions moved into shadows. And what happened to the women after they were purchased depended entirely on who claimed them next. Sales continued out of sight. Transactions moved into back rooms, courtyards, private residences. Demand never slowed. Profits remained enormous. And wherever demand exists, supply finds a way. What happened to these women after purchase depended entirely on who acquired them and for what purpose. The wealthiest buyers were assembling large household collections. Ottoman sultans maintained groups numbering in the hundreds, sometimes the thousands. The imperial collection inside Topkapi Palace in Constantinople housed as many as 2,000 women at various points in history. Provincial governors and lesser nobles kept smaller groups scaled to their wealth. Even moderately successful merchants often owned several women for household labor and personal purposes. These collections were far more complex than the modern understanding suggests. They were not simply about access. They represented power. They were political institutions where women competed constantly for favor. Bearing a son for a powerful man could change everything. The mother of a future sultan wielded influence that rivaled ministers and generals. So alliances formed, rivalries hardened, schemes unfolded quietly. Poisoning was common. Political maneuvering as intricate as anything in the official court played out behind guarded doors. For a captured African woman, entry into such a system meant the deliberate destruction of her former self. She was given a new name, her language was forbidden, her beliefs were replaced, her past was erased, then reconstructed into something useful. She was trained relentlessly, how to move, how to stand, how to speak, how to serve, what behavior was rewarded, what mistakes were punished. Over time, nothing remained of who she had been. The person her family once loved no longer existed, replaced by someone shaped entirely for ownership. A small number of women navigated this system successfully. Very few rose to real power. Kösem Sultan ruled Ottoman politics from behind the throne for decades. She began her life as a captive taken from a small Greek village. Hürrem Sultan achieved something almost unheard of. She became the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. History remembers them precisely because they were extraordinary exceptions. The system did not create Kösem Sultan. It destroyed thousands of women to produce one exception. For every woman whose name survived in records, thousands more lived and died unnamed, used until no longer useful, then quietly discarded. Women sold to less wealthy buyers faced different lives. Many became domestic workers with additional obligations. They cooked, they cleaned, they raised children, and they submitted whenever demanded. There was no concept of consent, no right to refuse. Islamic law did offer limited protections on paper. A woman who bore her master's child was called an walad, mother of a child. She could no longer be sold. Her child was legally free. When her master died, she was supposed to gain her freedom. But protections required enforcement. In reality, enforcement was inconsistent. These rights applied only after pregnancy. Before that moment, she remained property. Children born from these unions were legally free and often acknowledged. Some rose to prominence. Multiple sultans were born to captive mothers, but the mothers themselves remained in bondage unless explicitly freed. Whatever intimacy occurred was compelled, never chosen. Over generations, these children married into Arab populations. Physical features blended. African ancestry diluted with each generation until it faded from view, until it vanished. This was the final erasure, not just of individuals, but of their descendants. Not just of lives, but of any evidence those lives had ever existed. If you're still watching, stay with this because this story does not end here. The Arab-controlled system did not conclude with a dramatic abolition. There was no Emancipation Proclamation. No civil war fought over it. No defining moment when the world declared it finished. Instead, it faded slowly, reluctantly. Change came from outside pressure, not internal reckoning. British naval forces began shutting down East African routes in the late 19th century. The Royal Navy hunted ships at sea. Colonial administrations disrupted trans-Saharan networks as European powers divided Africa among themselves. International pressure forced formal abolitions throughout the 20th century. But the legacy left behind was not monuments, it was absence. Today in the Middle East, there are virtually no descendants of the 14 million African people taken there. The men were rendered unable to reproduce. The women's children were absorbed into surrounding populations. Their heritage dissolved until nothing remained. This is why silence is not accidental. It is the final outcome of the design. The victims vanish so completely that most people do not even know they existed. No films tell their stories, no holidays mark their suffering, no leaders speak their names. In 2020, archaeologists working in Libya uncovered a mass grave containing hundreds of remains. Analysis showed they were sub-Saharan Africans who perished in the 18th or 19th century. Almost certainly captive people who collapsed during the crossing and were left behind as caravans moved forward. They had no names recorded anywhere, no descendants to claim them, no one alive who remembered them, no grave markers, no memorials, only bones in the sand, silent proof of a catastrophe the world chose to forget. The Atlantic system left 45 million descendants who keep that history alive. The Arab-controlled network left silence. Nothing but silence. 14 million people erased so completely that we do not even know their names. The woman in the market, the one whose teeth were inspected, whose body was judged, whose humanity was stripped away piece by piece. We will never know what she was called before they took her name. The name her mother whispered. The name her village knew. She might have ended up in a Cairo household, competing for scraps of attention from a man who owned her. She might have lived in a residence in Baghdad, cooking and cleaning, summoned whenever desired. She might have faded into a corner of a palace in Istanbul, forgotten as youth passed. She might have borne children who never learned her language, who never heard her songs, who never knew her stories or where she came from. She might have perished in the desert, her bones joining millions of others along routes civilization pretends never existed. What we do know is this: nothing about this story survives unless it is carried forward deliberately. She existed, she suffered, she endured what no human being should ever endure. And for 13 centuries, millions like her sustained a machine designed to consume them entirely. The Atlantic system has museums, memorials, days of remembrance. This history has sand covering bones no one will ever identify. Remember her not as a number, not as a statistic. Remember her as someone's daughter, someone who laughed once, someone who had a name before it was erased. That may be the only memorial these 14 million ever receive. If this story mattered to you, drop a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments what time it is. and where you're watching from.